And to lead that discussion, I'm delighted to introduce Cornelia Dean, who's a science writer for the New York Times. As I mentioned before, I'm a New Yorker born and bred, so I will say without any objectivity that that's the single best newspaper in the world. And Cornelia served as science editor for many years, from 1997 to 2003. But in addition to being a journalist, she's also a professor and an author. She's a fixture at Harvard University, teaching seminars on communication of scientific information to the lay public, something that we know is important. Her first book was Against the Tide, The Battle for America's Beaches. And that was something that we heard a lot about over the course of a couple of panels today. The thing is, that book was written by Cornelia in 1999, long before this issue was really front and center in today's newspapers and today's headlines. She's currently working on a book on the misuse of scientific information in American public life, something I think many of us in the audience can relate to as well, and I hope is discussed here this afternoon. With that, let me turn it over to Cornelia.
Is it okay if I stand?
Yeah, if you want.
Okay, great. Yeah, I think I would.
A round of applause, please.
So I want to say thank you for inviting me to come. It's a very interesting session, and we have a great panel here of wonderful people, and there are many interesting issues. I hope we'll discuss coastal marine spatial planning, national ocean policy, environmental sustainability, and so on. But let me just tell you, what I want to do is just introduce everybody briefly and ask each member of the panel to just say briefly, why are you here? What brings you here? So immediately to my right is Captain Don Walsh, retired U.S. Navy captain, and most notable to me, I'm just realizing this at the time, I never thought that I would actually get to meet this man, but I remember when he and Jacques Piccard took the Trieste down to the deepest part of the ocean. And if someone had told me at the time, years from now, you'll get to meet this gentleman, I would have been thrilled. Anyway, so I'm thrilled now. Next to him is Sylvia Earle, and Sylvia has another amazing resume. Chief Explorer of the National, I wrote all this down and I've lost the page. Chief Explorer of the National Geographic Society.
They're just one of many.
Well,
so many chiefs.
A former chief scientist of NOAA.
Yeah,
And I asked Sylvia, where is she based? And you probably all know Sylvia very well. She doesn't need an introduction. But I asked Sylvia, where is she based? And she said, Florida, California, Washington, and the ocean. And I think
Not in that order.
That kind of, yes, probably the ocean first, sums up Sylvia. To Sylvia's right is Admiral Thad Allen, and we all heard a lot about him after Katrina and Rita. Coast Guard leader and leader in all kinds of security and other issues, but also now, if you saw his recent op-ed piece in the New York Times, an ardent advocate of the Law of the Sea Treaty. And to his right, Senator Sheldon Whitehouse from Rhode Island, which was my home state for many years, and where I'll be moving in the fall, actually.
Good.
I will be a voter in Rhode Island.
Be nice to her.
More important, leave your stuff where it is and buy new in Rhode Island.
Anyway, and do you actually have Claiborne Pell's seat? Do we call it that? No.
I have John Pastore's
John
seat.
Pastore's seat. Okay. Anyway, Rhode Island has a long tradition of Rhode Island senators of advocacy for the coasts. Claiborne Pell was a big coastal advocate, but now Sheldon Whitehouse is picking up that burden, and with Lisa Murkowski in the Senate Ocean Caucus. So now that you know who everybody is, it would be great if people just want to say briefly, if we can just start with Captain Walsh. What brings you here? Just briefly.
Well, you're not going to like my answer because I'm here because they gave me the Lifetime Achievement Award Tuesday.
You mean you wouldn't have shown up otherwise?
This is payback. And for those of you that weren't there, I took exception to that because I'm still achieving. That should have been pretty good so far award. But anyway, no, seriously, I think that the theme they've chosen this year is particularly good. That's sort of the integration of all the facets of the national interest in the oceans. I think for a lot of us in the community, it's sort of square one, a basic tutorial. But I would hope that the organization, Jason, pay attention, would take these programs, the presentations we've had, and get an editor, pull them together, and hand them to the people across the street. I think you'll get more leverage out of these sessions than all of us networking together. But the useful thing here is that what?
I'd like to introduce the person who is tasked with that very responsibility, Don, sitting right next to me.
Is this a new appointment?
No.
Sorry about that. Good. I'm glad you're going to do that. But I think the networking among us that are in this community is important, even though we could probably lip sync with an awful lot of what's being said, because it gives us a chance to get up to date, to fine tune our ideas, and that appealed to me enormously. So I'm glad to be here and kind of sit in and listen to what folks are saying.
Sylvia.
Well, I was pleased to accept the invitation to come, partly for the same reasons that Don has just expressed, to be in the company of people who can make a difference, people to whom I will pay attention and listen. But I'd like to, if possible, speak for those who can't be at this meeting, like the fish in the ocean, the whales, all of those creatures that we care about, but they're not here to speak for themselves, nor can those who are out there in the future somewhere. I think that it's up to us to speak for them, and I'll do my best. Being both a mom and a grandparent, I think a lot about where we're headed. And I'm particularly excited to have a chance to zero in on the concept that this, in all of history, is the sweet spot. Because never before have we been able to know what we now know. We couldn't know when Rachel Carson wrote Sea Around Us in 1951 that the ocean could be in this much trouble this fast. She thought, like everybody else at the time, middle of the 20th century, the ocean could accept pretty much what we wanted to put into it, and we could take out pretty much whatever we wanted to remove. But now we know. So 50 years ago, 60 years ago, it was too soon. We didn't know enough to be able to take the actions that we now not only can, but must take to ensure a prosperous future for humankind. 50 years from now, it'll be too late. This is truly the moment. And this occasion is irresistible to be part of the action and try to make a difference. Each of us, I think, has not just the opportunity, but the obligation to use whatever powers we have to carry that message and make the oceans prosper, and therefore with us as well.
Admiral Allen.
Well, it'd probably be our priority to say I spent 39 years in the Coast Guard, but beyond that, Sylvia told me to be here. Her deepness. As you know, I recently served as the principal federal official for the response to Hurricane Katrina and Rita, and then as a national incident commander for the Deepwater oil spill. So I've seen the intersection of the natural environment and man-built environment and man in the environment. I was also on the President's Task Force for National Ocean Policy, and currently I'm serving on the Blue Ribbon Panel on research in the Antarctic, which impacts also the Southern Ocean, and the wide gamut of issues that span both poles. I've been active in Arctic and Antarctic policy in my 4 years as Commandant of the Coast Guard, and recently, as was noted, wrote an op-ed piece for the New York Times with Rich Armitage and John Hamre urging ratification of the Law of the Sea Treaty. That can't be done fast enough. It should have been done a decade ago. We should be ashamed of ourselves.
Senator Whitehouse.
Well, I represent the ocean state, and we have a long oceanic tradition, beginning with the sacking and burning of the HMS Gaspee 240 years ago virtually today, which was the first incident in what became the American Revolution, up through the boat builders like the famous Herreshoff Boatyard, up through the America's Cup, which is actually returning to Rhode Island this summer. Fishing industry, boat building industry, tourism, beaches. We are very, very much an ocean state. In my own life, I grew up the son of a diplomat who somehow managed to get appointed to only coastal countries upon reflection. So I spent a lot of time in and around the ocean. Then I fell in love with and married a marine scientist. So to the question, why am I here? I have no choice.
Very good. So I know everyone will have a lot of interesting things to say about these issues, but I just want to throw out one question at the outset. In the current issue of Nature, the scientific journal Nature, there is what they call a Rio report card, an assessment of what's happened in the 20 years since the meeting at Rio. And Nature says there are three main agenda items: the framework on climate change, the Convention on Biological Diversity, and an effort on combating desertification, the growth of deserts. And Nature gives us collectively the grade of F on every single one of those issues. And so my question for this panel is, in view of that, well, would you agree? And secondly, if you would agree, what makes you able not to just turn your face to the wall and get into the aluminum siding business or something? I'd be interested in any thoughts anybody has on that.
You're going to Rio Plus 20.
Yeah, well, not only am I going to Rio Plus 20, I went to Rio Plus 20 minus 30. I was at the event in 1982 in London, where it was a rather small gathering, about 150 people, unlike the 50,000 who are coming to Rio in a couple of weeks. And we were asked, those of us who had a chance to go, included Jacques Cousteau, we were asked to identify the principal threats to the future of humankind, and they're still pretty much on the balance sheet. But what resonated mostly at that point was nuclear holocaust. That was more on the minds of people then than it is now, but it's still a big issue. Second and third and fourth were all clustered together. It was the growing population now, 7 billion. Back in 1982, it was right around 4 billion. So things have not gotten any easier since 1982. And poverty, which is a consequence of degradation of nature, which is the third and fourth loss of species and destruction of or undermining our life support functions of the planet. It all anchors back to what we're doing to the natural systems that keep us alive. And I'm interested that the assessment now doesn't have front and center the state of the ocean. I mean, it's implied, but it doesn't say outright that the blue face of the planet, about half of the world, is high seas. And what are we doing about that? And maybe the law of the sea, when it finally kicks in with our signature on the dotted line, we'll be able to have more of a say. But right now, it's up for grabs. It's part of the reason that this is the moment in time that we have to use our voices and be a voice for the blue. No blue, no green, lots of green voices, and that counts, but we aren't really facing up to what's happening to the ocean and taking the action. We're still living with the policies made back 50 years ago when we thought that the ocean was able to handle whatever we took out of it or whatever we wanted to put into it. And now we know, and we just can't sit still and let the degradation continue. Everything rests, everything, on taking care of the ocean. If we fail in that, nothing else is really going to matter.
So does anyone see signs of optimism, something that makes you smile about the way things are going? Can anybody point to
Laugh
anything
hysterically?
like that? No, not laugh hysterically, but is there? Captain Walsh?
I've been involved in things ocean since 1959, when I was a young officer in submarines, and I was only curious about having enough water under the keel so we submerged, we didn't hit the side of a continent or something. And then when I got with the Trieste program, we started taking all of these oceanographers down. What a curious group of people they were, like people like Sylvia, that investigating the oceans, and I got hooked. And with that as a preface, I've been preaching I guess, theology of the oceans for half a century, and I'll be damned if I know how to have a lot of impact, except keep trying, and hope that somehow they're getting through. But when the world population goes up 2 billion people, how do you? That's a lot of people to talk to. I don't know how you ever get that kind of leverage. So I'm not smiling a lot.
Okay, I don't want to.
I'll come back to me, but I
One
do
good
have some
thing I would
comments.
mention is that I do think that awareness is climbing. It used to be that if you thought about the oceans, it was how exciting it is to go with Jacques Cousteau down to the bottom of the sea, and how beautiful it all is. And I think now we see a more complex portrait of the oceans when we look into the general public media, although still the pretty pictures do tend to dominate and undercut the real news, which is that things are really awry. But if you look at the environmental community, there's been a real shift. The ocean organizations have really climbed in significance, and all the traditional terrestrial environmental organizations, Nature Conservancy, World Wildlife, Conservation International, League Conservation Voters, all have either taken a big turn towards the ocean or opened a big arm of the organization towards the ocean. And so I think there's been a real step in the right direction. But again, it's a step by the leading edge, and we've got a long way to go, particularly probably the bleakest spot, second to the ExxonMobil boardroom, is the Congress, where we still have people saying that, this whole carbon pollution thing is just a big hoax, and still trying to support the phony front organizations that are designed by polluters to confuse the American public and create just enough doubt to dodge political bullets with.
I actually want to come back to that later, that issue later, if you don't mind. But Admiral Allen, is there anything you want to?
Well, I think the issues are being framed in starker terms because the issue of conflicted uses and the need to deconflict are becoming more prominent. When you look at the
In other words, it's not possible to just let things drift anymore? Is that?
well, I think with the good part of the 24-hour news cycle and the ubiquity of information is that things that were not well known before are visible and more transparent now. And I think, for instance, the intersection of the requirements for hydrocarbons, at least for the next 30 years until renewable energy is developed, and the shrinking polar ice cap and open waters in the Arctic start to offer a way to frame and have conversations that bring on a greater sense of urgency. I'm not sure that's good news, but it forces the conversation to occur. And having worked the issues I have for the past several years on conflicted use out there, I think that drives a discussion much quicker for people that didn't think they had if you will, a dog in the fight.
Well, it was interesting when someone mentioned the Law of the Sea Treaty, and there was applause in the room. And I think probably there's agreement on the panel that it would be good if we signed on to this. Is there anyone here who doesn't think that's a good idea?
It would be good.
And yet, and in fact, this view that it's a good thing and we should sign on to it seems to have been widespread for a long time, and yet we have not signed on. What is the lesson you draw from that? What should we be thinking in view of this inability to get our hands around something that there seems to be a vast range of opinion that it's a good thing?
Well, if I could just make an additional comment, I think some of the conflicts that are arising out there are going to bring this discussion to a head, and I think that's necessary. I apologize if I was overly dramatic earlier on, but you watch in frustration over the years and failure to bring this legislation to the floor, and I know there's an attempt to do that now, and
Is it going to succeed?
I applaud that. Well,
Will it succeed?
we'll have to ask our colleague here. But I do think that the ongoing issues that are out there, you have to understand when you look at the high seas, the Arctic, which is not governed by a treaty the way the Antarctic is. The default setting in this world right now for governance of the oceans is the Law of the Sea Treaty. And we do have issues where there's probably more that could be done for unreported, illegal, and unregulated fishing, where there is not an adequate mechanism in place. But again, I think the Law of the Sea Treaty will get more visibility, and the discussion will occur again only because these conflicts will force it.
And the ocean around Antarctica is high seas, so there's no treaty that really governs that.
But do you think it would be possible for, if we were starting fresh with the Antarctic Treaty, would we sign on to that today?
With the ocean included, maybe.
Well,
We
I mean,
should-
would we be able to get it through the Congress?
That's a good question. Again, I defer to our colleague. I will say that it may not be as great a coverage as we want, but the southern oceans are addressed as part of that treaty, maybe not as robustly as we would like it to be.
Yeah, I think it would happen again. The Antarctic Treaty, the situation down there where you don't really have ownership of that land because the treaty set aside claims. Doesn't eliminate them. It just said put them on the shelf. And it worked rather well in 1961, and I think that probably could happen again. The interesting byproduct of that treaty is that it was a very useful model for the United States to say, because there's inspection provisions in it. We could fly, I've spent some time down there, we could fly around the Antarctic and land in Russian stations and German stations, so almost without notification. That was the inspection provision. Well, it was very useful for our government as we came up into the arms limitations discussion. The United States has a history, a habit of doing this. But I do think, in answer to your question, that you could do it again. But as Sylvia quite rightly says, the Southern Ocean has to be brought into it more. You'd have to perhaps expand the boundaries of the treaty concern, but it could happen again.
So, well, now my question is, well, why don't we have the law of the sea treaty? What is in the way?
Well, you're dealing with lands that belong to governments. Down there, it was,
Is that it? I mean, I've read a little bit about this, and I see the objections that people put forward, and I don't want to say it's the black helicopter crowd, but it seems to be
Pretty close.
verging on, things that don't. I read this, and I think, is that actually rational? And it doesn't. The objections seem to be, sometimes a little adrift from reality. In
Why
some
aren't
ways.
we signatories?
Yes,
I mean,
why aren't we there all? I mean, everybody loves it.
It started in the 80s with the deep sea mining issues
Yeah.
and the desire on the part of U.S. legislators to protect U.S. vested interest in deep sea mining. And there was the illusion that this was going to be the next big deal. And it has flowed from that, U.S. interests in biodiversity.
But there seems to be an agreement now that the way to
Industrial
protect our
interests.
interest is to sign on to it, not to be apart from it.
That's what some of us
For a long
think.
time, yeah.
And yet we're not.
Yeah.
Well, in the early days, it was Senator Helms and the Senate Foreign Affairs Committee, and he objected to the fact that Americans would be brought before foreign tribunals, and he wouldn't even have hearings, and until that leadership changed. But over the years, for one reason or another, it would never advance out on the floor of the Senate. The interesting thing now, and I think that may make it happen, is a curious thing. It's called the Chinese. For different reasons, the Republicans and Democrats are very paranoid with a small p, perhaps, worried about the Chinese misbehaving in the Far East, South China Sea, East China Sea. Both sides agree that maybe we better get in there and be legitimized by the treaty. So this may be, for all the wrong reasons, a convergence in bipartisanship.
So, Senator Whitehouse, if you were a betting person, could you
My
say?
bet would be that the law of the sea treaty would be brought up in the Senate after the November elections, and that it would clear the Senate. Senator Kerry, Chairman Kerry, is exerting immense leadership, and I think Senator Lugar is very sensible about this. And I think that there are more rational than irrational votes on this subject, and that as competition for the Arctic resources is opened up because of the receding ice cap, some of our friends are seeing more interest from oil and other companies and are dialing back a little bit the sort of nativist, I think largely imaginary or ill-founded objection to it, but one that has kept it off the floor for these many years.
Will the reasoning prevail when it gets to the House?
It doesn't have to.
That's right. Senate. That's right.
Yeah.
Senate. Okay. So, in other words, your bet would be yes
My bet is yes,
by the end of the year.
by the end of the year.
You heard it here first.
Okay.
Yeah, I believe,
We heard it here first.
I think the two main driving forces behind this are going to be the ability under the Law of the Sea Treaty to extend your claim on the outer continental shelf beyond 200 miles if you can prove a certain set of scientific criteria that is an extension of the continental shelf and the resources that are attendant thereto in the Arctic. That is going ahead at the same time. There are issues about freedom of navigation related to expansion of Chinese presence in the South China Sea and Scarborough Reef and the Spratly Islands between the Philippines, Vietnam, and China that are begging the issue of whether or not that is in line with the Law of the Sea Treaty. The issue with issues related to the sea, if you do it long enough, it becomes what they call customary law, and you can actually evolve and change the law of the sea. I don't think we want another national power to start asserting some derivation of rights to operate where we don't think they ought to in conformance with the Law of the Sea Treaty, and it's hard for us to take that position and enforce it if we're not a signatory.
Yep, Sylvia?
You were asking about reasons for to be optimistic, be hopeful. Well, certainly this is one, and it gives us an edge forward with respect to the high seas that doesn't now exist, a voice, if you will. Consider that there's so much of the planet that is like the Wild West. I mean, it's true with most of the ocean, but it's especially true of the high seas. But Senator Whitehouse's response to say that we know more now and that there is a growing awareness, I think, is the best reason for hope. I attended a security conference here in Washington a few weeks ago, and there were a lot of generals and admirals and others around who were talking about security in the traditional sense, but the environment really got some play, including the ocean issues. But one bright spark said, what we really need is an education bomb, a bomb that would just, spread knowledge everywhere, an awareness of where we are in the greater scheme of things. So, and you know what? We have one. I mean, the internet exists. You've got iPhones and iPads and means of spreading the word in ways that even 5 years ago didn't exist. I mean, I love the fact that you can dive into Google Earth and into the ocean and see things that you could not see before 2009. And kids can do it, and senators can do it, and admirals can do it.
No, I
Anybody can do it.
hope it makes a difference.
It makes a difference. if
There's
you know.
there's a theory when scientists talk about communicating with the public, they tend to say the unfortunate reality is that the public is way too stupid to understand anything that I would have to say. People call that the deficit model. And I'm not sure that ignorance is necessarily always the issue. With questions like the law of the sea, perhaps. But in any event,
It starts there, though.
yes.
I think that on a lot of these questions, to run a little bit counter to what Sylvia just said, the internet expands the amount of information that people have access to, but the people who are engaged in disinformation
It's true.
are much more strategic, because that's the entire purpose. The people who are engaged in information, scientists and Google Earth and so forth, they just kind of put it out there. But it is far more the disinformation effect is far more powerful than the information effect because of the strategic component to the disinformation.
And also,
So
I
we've
think
gotta get better.
sometimes the factors that make people hold one view or another don't actually have to do with the facts. They have to do with some overall view of the world or whatever. So I wanted to ask this group also, I actually want to start by saying I did a little bit of writing about a proposal called Cape Wind, which is a wind farm that has been proposed for land offshore between Cape Cod and Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard. And there happens to be a very small part of that area that is not, it's outside of the control of the state of Massachusetts. It's beyond the state's limits. And that's where this wind farm is going to go. And it has been interesting to me from day one that the arguments over it were, well, it will hurt the birds, it will not hurt the birds, it will hurt the fish, it will hurt the fishermen, it will blah, 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 blah. But what I kept waiting for someone to say was, we have no regulatory regime for these lands. I was waiting for someone to say we should not be citing anything on these lands until we have a regulatory regime for them, which brings us to the National Ocean Policy. Where are we on that, and does that have a chance of coming true?
Well, maybe I could start out the discussion here. There is a regulatory regime, but it's a licensing permitting process.
Well, actually,
And the reason I want to make the point is, unless there's a means to deconflict uses and have a discussion about the optimal use and shared use, the default setting of the regulations and laws that are in place to process applications for current activities. So in the case of the wind farm, there is a regulatory process and a licensing and permitting process, so it is regulated, but
Well, what
it is
I-
regulated in isolation.
so I don't want to beat this dead horse, but I cannot resist saying that when I started writing about it, with the Corps of Engineers was the permitting agency, and the Corps itself said, well, it's by default. There's nobody else to do it, so we're doing it. And I said, what about the Minerals Management Service? And they said, oh, no, they can't do it. It's not extractive, so it doesn't belong to them. Okay,
They've
fine.
got it now.
Years go by, permits are given or not given, hearings are held or not held, and then suddenly, oops, it is the Minerals Management Service. That's true. So that kind of process does not imbue anybody with confidence that things are being run reasonably.
And nobody asks the fish.
Well, that, of course, definitely. But so given all of that, I mean, where would you say, if we can hope reasonably that we'll sign on to the Law of the Sea Treaty by the end of the year, where are we on actually having a working national oceans policy?
Let me answer that in a couple of ways. First of all, the President has signed off on the National Oceans Policy, so to the extent that executive order can do things, they are being done. To the extent that it takes legislation to implement or fund programs in the executive orders, they've run into a very big pre-election anti-Obama general suspicion of government headwind. But that doesn't mean they can't go forward with the purely executive parts. The second point that I'd make that I take from your Cape Wind example is that I don't know how long Cape Wind has been going, more than a decade.
Yes.
And every inch of that process has been a fight and a battle and a nightmare. If you go one state over to Rhode Island, where we got heavily behind an ocean SAMP, an Ocean Special Area Management Plan under the CZMA, the Coastal Zones Management Act, and we did the legwork up front to bring together, we can't bring the fish in, but we can bring in the fishermen, the conservationists, the environmentalists, the people who ship cargo in and out, the people who run the offshore races, and begin to, as Admiral Allen said, deconflict those uses. Grover Fugate and our Coastal Resources Management Council and our University of Rhode Island did immense work to get that all done. The result is the Deepwater Wind, which is the applicant for our offshore wind, is legging steadily through that process, is at the last stages of approval for the Department of Interior to let it go. And so the lesson that I take from this is that if you are in the business community and you want to be investing in offshore uses, the so-called marine spatial planning effort, which the SAMP plan was, is actually the best thing that can happen to you. You would way rather be the person who is trying to build in Rhode Island with all of that data and all of that agreement cleared. You're not having fights with the Native Americans. You're not having fights with the fishermen. You know what is the case before you go in. Then you would be the person who bought the location off of the Delaware Harbor that happened to be in the channel for the boats coming out of Delaware Harbor because nobody bothered to deconflict. So I know that the marine spatial planning is a part of this conference, and I think you've touched on it and provided actually a living example of why the business community and the investment community that is interested in the oceans should see this as a enormous asset for their efforts so that they're not wasting time, as Cape Wind did, chasing through this thorny mess that they had to fight. Instead, they can come in and say, okay, that looks like a good spot, that looks like a good spot, the work has been done, and we can make our decisions and go forward.
So,
I'd love to weigh in on just the observation that 100 years ago, we were still at a place where we were looking at land in this country in the way that now, for the first time in history, we're able to look at the ocean. Or maybe you have to go back 200 years to see the equivalent in terms of our attitude about terrestrial issues that we now face, not just we in this country, but any coastal nation. Just last week, I was in Bermuda, where the country is looking at their exclusive economic zone, and they're both the opportunity but also the responsibility that they now face. So what do we do with the part of the planet that is much larger than the land, the blue part? And what they're thinking about, seriously considering, is something that they were celebrating last week as the blue halo, that within 50 miles, fishermen could fish in the way they are pretty much today, but from 50 to 100 miles, they would declare it as a fully protected area. It would be an area like a safe zone, a security zone, if you will, not just for people, but for the ocean itself. And island nations in the Pacific are embracing this concept. They have a little bit of land and a lot of ocean. And this move that you might hear that 10% by 2020 or 20% by 2020 of the ocean in some form of real protection could be achievable, especially as you see the idea that there's a blue United States, there's a blue Australia that's bigger than the landmass. And this is the first time that we have seriously embraced the issue of what are we going to do about it? Should we just go the way our attitude was 200 years ago, the exploit, 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 or armed with the knowledge that we now have to proceed with care and bank large pieces of it against the unknowns that are more obvious than the knowns?
But of
It's-
course, the question of how many marine reserves we should have and how large they should be, that's a controversial question as well, right? I mean, in some circles, there are people who would argue against it.
Well,
Does anyone have I see Senator Whitehouse nodding. Is there?
Not just because I hear it secondhand. I
yeah.
think people who are using these resources are very concerned that the marine reserves get developed outside of a process that includes their ability to be heard and influence the outcome. I think, again, back to the question of marine planning, if you have the chance to really develop the overlays of data and get everybody at the table, those decisions begin to become a lot easier because you can identify what's really important to various interests and protect those.
It's interesting how this is again something I've written about very little, but I have written a little bit about it. And what I notice as a reporter is when for example, if I ever put the word zoning in an article about this, you can realistically expect an explosion of rage from somebody. And I have never, I mean, it seems to me that that's just about exactly what we're talking about in this process. And it makes me wonder if we cannot call it by what seems to me to be its right name. I wonder what its prospects are. If the subject itself is so ticklish that you don't even want to deal with it. So
But I don't think it is zoning. Zoning is very specific. It creates boundaries. It says, here's this and here's that, and once it's down, it's there to stay. This is much more like a state geodetic mapping type system, where you gather its process and its information, and you layer all the information.
no, but I mean, once
and
you put a
bring the
wood
folks
farm
into
in
the
there, it's in
process.
there, right?
But you do it entity by entity, and people can draw their own conclusions from it. You don't have to force it to the point of, okay, this is industrial ocean, this is residential ocean. I do think that the zoning tag on this is a misnomer, and it deprecates in a way that is inaccurate the flexibility that this process allows, both through time and across interests.
by having protected areas in the ocean doesn't mean you can have at all the rest without no holds barred. What we do face at this point in time is the awareness that everything we care about is dependent on maintaining the planetary processes that are currently at risk. And by protecting our life support system, which is really what we're aiming at the end, it's something that's good for whatever you care about.
And in that regard, we should note the warning bell that rang this spring in the Arctic when our atmospheric measurements for the first time hit 400 parts per million of carbon dioxide, which is well outside the boundary that our species has lived in for 800,000 years. And if 800,000 years sounds like a big number and you need some context, we probably started actually scratching the dirt and planting things 10 to 15,000 years ago. The first human remains in Africa are 150, 160,000 years old. So it's been a long run in that 190 to 300 parts per million safety zone that we've had. And this adventure we've taken outside of that zone, across the rumble strip and out into new territory, is something that really merits attention. And yet when we hit 400 parts per million outside of a few scientific journals and environmental blogs, who knew?
I know, why was that not a moment? I don't understand that either.
Got me.
Well, it's not all by itself. I mean, there are a number of big thinkers who are looking at this envelope that sort of are the safe zone for humankind. And we're pushing the edge of that with respect to the loss of the diversity that puts us at risk. We need the stability that comes with having diverse, stable systems. The acidification of the ocean is a big deal. Looking at the nitrogen cycle, the oxygen in the atmosphere that is largely generated by creatures in the sea, that all of that is currently, for the first time we're aware of it, and for the first time we really recognize that we're not making this stuff up. I mean, here are the facts, and unlike other creatures who have experienced this same time of rapid change, and there are a lot of them, the whales that live for 200 years, some fish can live that long, birds that can live as long as I have lived, turtles, good heavens, but they don't know why these changes are taking place. We know. They don't know what to do about it, even if they knew. We know, which is why we have a chance. And that's why this meeting is so important, and why your voice is so important.
Well,
it's everybody. Don't be quiet about 400 parts.
I have one other issue I want to raise with you all, but before I don't want, does anyone have something they want to say about where we've gone so far that you haven't had a chance to say?
Oh yeah, I do. One more thing. But go ahead.
No, I didn't have a thing.
Okay.
It's all you,
don't?
Sylvia.
Oh my goodness. Well, all right.
And also, I want we will have to save time to because I know people in the audience will have questions. So,
Well, my colleague here, 1960, heroically with Jacques Picard, made the descent to full ocean depth. And it was not until this year that it was possible to almost, but not quite, get as deep as you went. It was 34 feet short.
No, 84.
84 feet, and 12 inches, 6 inches.
But who's counting?
Yeah. Don't tell Jim.
He knows. And here's the thing. We need to explore the blue part of the planet. And we are backing away from it in this country, while in Russia, in China, in India, they're moving lickety-split with fostering new technologies and amping up the old technologies. What we're doing high in the sky continues, and yet, yes, we are falling short of what we probably should be doing for satellites and for other space initiatives. But in the ocean, we've neglected it, and it's really costing us dearly. To zero out the Aquarius underwater laboratory, to zero out NERP that includes the Pisces subs, when the big blowout occurred in the Gulf of Mexico, where were the scientific tools to be able to go down a mile beneath the water? Well, the Pisces subs were able to do that. The Alvin finally did get there. Remotely operated vehicles, mostly owned by industry, but the Coast Guard didn't have any handy submarines in their garage. NOAA didn't have any. And here we are facing the biggest threats to the ocean that we ever have, and we're backing away from the very technologies that can serve us to understand the ocean and do what it takes to take care of the ocean.
so that actually, believe it or not, relates to the question I wanted to ask, which is brought to my mind often, but at the moment it's brought to my mind by an effort that's going on in the legislature of North Carolina to compel the planners in the state, when they consider sea level rise, to consider only historical data up to now, and to disregard any indication that sea level rise might be accelerating. In other words, it almost feels like, King Canute saying the tide is not going to come in. When I think about something like this, I think about something that I witnessed in the House years ago when FEMA wanted to alter the flood insurance program to take account of erosion rates. They wanted to build erosion rates into the rate structure. And that proposal was met with such violent opposition from the coastal real estate interests that the coastal geologists who were working on it told me they actually feared they were going to lose all their research money. And one of them said, and this is the memorable phrase that I wish I had invented myself, he said, there is a constituency of ignorance on the coast. And in other words, they were producing information that some important segment of society just wished was not there. They just didn't want to deal with. And I would like to know whether members of the panel think that this issue of basically not, we don't want to know about this because the news is not going to be good. And it's only going to thwart our more immediate goals that we have right now. Do you think that's an issue? And if so, how do you combat it?
It's a terrific issue where I am.
Yeah.
It's the prevailing situation in Congress.
The constituency of ignorance.
Yeah.
It's a
And the
conspiracy.
desire to maintain it.
Captain Walsh.
I'm not even sure it's a marketing problem. We've talked about ocean awareness and how do you establish that within a culture, not just our country, but anywhere in the world. My view, long held, is that you have to start at kindergarten. You have to grow up with the oceans being a fact of life. You don't really think about it like breathing. It's an involuntary mental reaction in that case. The kids can count, instead of 3 apples, 3 whales, and you haven't exploded anybody's curriculum in kindergarten. But there ought to be more in that. Now, when I was in graduate school at Texas A&M, I remember looking at some of the curricular materials in primary and secondary schools, and there's not any evidence there in those days, mid-60s, that Texas was a coastal state. Why? Because Texas was populated by people walking in overland. Therefore, it's not really a coastal state. And if you're a man from Mars and came down your spacecraft and said, show me your teaching materials, I think you'd see that in a lot of coastal states. The maritime heritage and the understanding that whether you live in St. Louis or San Diego, the oceans are part of all of us, that everything we use probably moved by water, someplace between producer and consumer. So ocean awareness is so important. I don't think you can do it if you start with adults. I think you have to start at the very basis. So people grow up. It's just part of your life. You don't really think about it every moment. It just, as I say, like breathing. But what we've got is a culture of ocean indifference. And for various reasons, either ignorance or Machiavellian reasons, we have a culture of ocean indifference. It really is a marketing problem. If you want to simplify it, a lot of people don't like that. How do you sell the oceans to a culture? And it's not easy, at least in my view.
You think
Well,
the
you
fact
start
that
out with-
that the fish are invisible is a problem that you can't see in there?
Well, and we've often said this, you've probably all heard it, that it was, I don't know, 10 or 15 years ago, one of the a member of Congress said, well, fish don't vote. That's why it's not important. Well, shame on him. He's no longer around, so we're still here, so let's go with it.
So in kindergarten, you learn your ABCs and you learn your numbers, but it's not just the ocean, it's nature writ large. We have failed to make the connection that we're a part of the natural systems that are dominated by water, of course, but nonetheless, that we're a part of nature, not apart from it. And you're right, we take breathing for granted, but we're at that point where we can't do that anymore. We have demonstrated that we can change the nature of nature, the atmosphere, the water, the fabric of life itself, and that puts us at risk. So, I mean, you're right in expressing something bordering on despair, perhaps, at where we are, that there's, what are the reasons for hope? But the real hope, I think, is that the knowledge is there, and the real solution to solving this problem is getting better at communicating what is known. and exploring what we don't know.
The situation in North Carolina is amazing to me because the Outer Banks of North Carolina, probably people here have been there. The Outer Banks of North Carolina is a very important part of the state's tourism economy, which is a very important part of its economy. And those islands are literally threatened with destruction, and not in the long term, in the near term. And yet, the view seems to be this information is inconvenient, so we're going to turn our faces away from it. And I just wonder how, in our political environment now, how do we move past that? How do we overcome that?
One very practical suggestion, and I throw this out to the environmental organizations who are represented here and to folks who are internet savvy, is to be able to get on the web or go to an environmental wiki of some kind and actually get good local information. Because if you're in the denial camp, it's very easy to ignore and laugh about a press release from the Sierra Club. But if your home state university, Department of Weather Sciences has made a report, if the Quail Hunters Foundation has written a letter about the changed habitat, if your DOT has just rebuilt the bridge 4 feet higher because they had to, those things become a lot harder to rebut. The out-of-state and political chatter is tuned out before it even gets there. It's the home state facts that give people the best leverage to make the point with their home state senators, and there is no place in which that is categorically and systematically collected. I should be able to flip to a book that says, okay, Oklahoma, and go through the papers that have been published by the Department of Geological Science, by the determinations that have been made by the Fish and Wildlife Department, by the, in Florida, what mayors have said, well, we have to relocate where our sewage facility is because it's too close to the water, and in 20 years it's going to be underwater. And that information would be immensely valuable, but there is no clear wiki to go and get it.
I have actually proposed that science museums do that, and that they marshal their local people, because I think that's right. If you live in Rhode Island, you know who the University of Rhode Island is. You know what the Graduate School of Oceanography is. You're prepared to take their word for it, probably. But
If I could, maybe on a larger scale, I think there's a larger framework that we need to talk about, and it would be risk communication and risk acceptance, especially as it relates to the human-built environment. And I think this is where the senator was going. I don't think we always understand when we make decisions, and sometimes there are ideological or parochial views that are driving that. But I think in general, we have incomplete discussions about the risk inherent in our infrastructure, a lack of resiliency, and there is no conscious risk acceptance of what we're doing. I serve on the advisory board for the Division of Earth and Life Studies at the National Academy of Science, National Research Council, and they're working on a concept called a North American Risk Map. It tries to aggregate information and they make that available to the public. And but it leads us to another very vexing question, and I have to almost have to speak on behalf of Jane Lubchenko. She's not here, and a very good friend of mine. This is the whole notion of sensing and developing baseline data so you know when a change does occur. There was talk earlier about the spill in the Gulf. One of our big challenges was that due to the lack of baseline data, we did not have a reference point for the ambient presence of hydrocarbons in the water column so we could measure the change from.
right.
And there are a lot of decisions that have to be made about how you want to acquire what information, how are you going to use that information moving forward. But it's all tied up, in my view, this notion of trying to assess risk of the natural world and the man-built world, and then the acceptance of that risk and how to talk about it.
It's really doubly ironic that in Florida, there are 30 years of data about coral reefs have been assembled by scientists working from the National Underwater Laboratory, the Aquarius, a unique facility where you actually use the ocean as a laboratory instead of taking sponges and things off to your place in wherever it is on the land. You actually study them where they live, and that's about to be zeroed out. And how can we do that at this time of obvious need, especially looking
Well,
at...
you see this all the time, that it's easy to portray counting the number of snails on the particular place, or counting the amount of hydrocarbons, or counting some. It's easy to portray that as a woolly-headed waste of time, and a muddle-headed waste of time. And
But monitoring is now getting great play.
No,
You've got to take baseline information.
I think you're absolutely right, but no one is ever going to win the Nobel Prize for monitoring. And
I hope you're wrong.
Well, I hope I'm wrong too, because I think it's absolutely crucial. But
It's assessing change over time that we're now facing. I mean, actually looking at monitoring carbon dioxide in the atmosphere really was vital in assessing where we are with respect to climate change. Monitoring the loss of ice in polar areas has been critical to establishing the policies that we now face. Monitoring the loss of fish in the sea, the decline of coral reefs, all of that is so fundamental we take it for granted. And it is Nobel Prize stuff.
I hope you're right.
You can't have a ruler without zero.
No, it's that's absolutely correct. But in many cases, we don't have the zero. I mean, as you say in the Gulf, we don't have the zero.
You know, if you want to go back to historical fundamentals, Senator mentioned that the president has a lot of power with executive orders. And though old-timers here realize that NOAA was created by executive order by President Reagan, it still doesn't exist under statute, except a basket full of
Nixon.
statutes. I'm sorry.
Nixon.
Nixon, yes.
I was there,
excuse me.
underwater.
I was there too. I brought the first copy back to the Pentagon. He created the CEQ and NOAA essentially in the two executive orders the same day.
1970.
Yep.
Yeah.
And and it still doesn't exist as a statute. It doesn't have an organic act where it was created by Congress. So even this agency that's brought us all together here was started on an executive order. And for years have been trying to make it right. And it works, obviously, but it would have been better if it had an organic act.
It was supposed to be a wet NASA,
Yeah.
they said at the time. But it didn't turn out that way.
So I think we can throw the conversation open to the group. I'm sure there are people who have questions. Anybody? Yes? Oh, there you go. Great. Anyone has a question? We have a microphone.
I guess we licked the plate clean. If
No,
there's
no, we gotta-
oh, okay.
Oops.
While we're gearing up for our first question, let me just say that I have a plane to catch to get home, so I'm going to have to leave in just a couple of minutes.
Well, thank you very much for being here.
It has been a great honor to be on this group. I think it confirms the view that people have that the Senate is a lens for the amplification of small deeds, that I should be lined up on this panel with basically the John Glenn of the seas, one of the great scientists of the seas, and the hero both of Katrina and the Gulf spill. But it has been an honor to be with all of them, and I understand that Senator Murkowski may be coming, and I just want to say a quick word. When we started the Oceans Caucus in the Senate, the three people who were first willing to be associated with it before they knew anything, that they were willing to be the three starters, were Lisa Murkowski, Olympia Snowe, and Lindsey Graham. And it's a lot easier for me to support that kind of stuff than it is for them. So I hope that all of you will be very appreciative of Lisa and also of Olympia and Lindsay whenever you see them. They were willing to step out on this from the very beginning in what is for them a much more difficult environment than it is for me. So thank you everybody for including me, and if I get up, it's not because of anything anybody said.
I think we have a question.
Yeah, I'm John Jensen from Sea Education Association, and just curious, and we've listened to you folks, we have been ineffective in messaging in so many ways. And this is a self-serving question, what do you see the role of education and education policy in bridging this deficit between science and the public and the ocean? I'm thinking particularly in terms of higher education or policy within the context of high school. It's one thing to talk about catching them in kindergarten, but are there specific things that we can do and put resources to create the people who can be the next generation of leaders, perhaps more effective than the ones like us that are in this room now?
it's so fundamental. And every tool in the box we need to pull out, combining the sensitivity of art and music with the, call it wisdom, if you will, of science. And not just make it a scientific exercise, but to use humor when you can. I love what Jim Toomey does with Sherman's Lagoon. He makes you laugh at yourself. And anything that it takes to put things in perspective, I think. Again, I keep going back to that crazy bird that I met in Midway, halfway across the Pacific. Wisdom, that 61-year-old albatross who doesn't know what any 10-year-old kid knows, what any 5-year-old human being knows. We are the only ones who have the power to maintain the stability of the planet that now works pretty much in our favor, but it is tipping away from those circumstances, and this is the time. So, I mean, there's a sense of urgency that we need to convey. It's not just nice. It's not an option. It should be considered vital, and with a sense of now's the time, and it's critical. Get with it, kids, you know?
Well, and of course, if we think in terms of Alpha and Omega, your program is Alpha. I mean, you're taking the kids out on sailing vessels, and they're learning the real lore of the sea in a fun way, and a sort of multi-experience way.
Under the ocean, too.
Well, yeah.
They throw them
right,
in.
Yeah. But now Omega are the underprivileged kids. When I was on faculty, University of Southern California, we had kids in East LA, 20 miles from the ocean, never been there. And I've heard other anecdotal stories, you all probably have them, that live within a few miles of the sea and have never been able to get there. And when people say, well, they're not curious, well, that's baloney. It's because they don't have, there's no way to facilitate their getting out there. And these are all sponges. Now you can, squeeze it and it's going to suck up its environment. And if you can bring those sponges down to the seashore and watch them, the amazement on their faces, and I've seen a lot of that there, just down in L.A. Harbor, where we have the Carrillo Beach and places like that. The kids are brought down the school buses, and they can't believe, what's out there. In the Dennis the Menace cartoon a few years ago, and I've never been able to find that one because I'd like to use it for my lecture programs. It shows little Joey and Dennis looking out at the sea, holding hands, the sun's setting, and Dennis is saying, and there's a lot more under there.
I wouldn't underestimate Sylvia's comment about young kids in kindergarten. We raised a smoking repulsed generation in this country by making it part of the education system. Mm-hmm. They have made California a more resilient state because they do an annual exercise in the schools called Shake It Up that is now spread into communities and corporate organizations out there that are responsive to those kind of cues, and I would say seatbelts is probably another one. So I think you have to start at the beginning, otherwise you keep losing a 15 to 20 year gap, and you always have that cohort group to try and deal with.
But we don't have a lot of time. That's the other part of it. We have to amp it up.
I think, and this, I can't prove it medically, and probably it's baloney, but I think everybody's born with the exploration gene.
Yeah.
Look at baby in the mother's arms. It's looking around the world, the room, and it's exploring. And when they get mobile, they're running around the restaurant peeling the gum off the bottom of the tables and putting it in their mouth. That's all exploration. And somehow in the teen years, because of hormones or peer pressure, whatever, it gets beat out of them. And very few of those explorers, the gene's still there. I guess it's recessive at that point. And so when you get into your 20s, become an adult, other things take over. But everybody is born an explorer. I define exploration as simply curiosity acted on. We all can be curious about things and say, I wonder how that happens or why it works, and then a minute later it's gone and we're doing something else. But if you go on the internet or pick up a book and try and figure out, how does that flower, that beautiful flower, know from that seed what it's supposed to do? And that's curiosity. You act on it because you look it up and you find it out. And somehow we have to learn how to trap and exploit that exploration gene to get them through those terrible teen years so they come out the other side. Because, say, from sort of 5 to 10 years old, you can just open the top of their heads and pour it in, and they really understand. I mean, look how quickly they can develop language or musical skills at those ages. And we can do the same thing if we could just get at them.
But it's not just hormones. It's the grown-ups around them.
Yeah, sure.
We're so pleased to hear those words, those first words, and you're so pleased when kids start to walk. And as soon as they do, they start to walk, they start to talk, and then you say, sit down and shut up. It's like that. Instead of saying, yes, kid, go explore.
Well, there are a lot of people who say that one problem is the way we teach science, particularly laboratory science. Because when you have a science lab, if you remember like chem lab or physics lab or whatever, you are typically given a set of tools, a recipe for what you're going to do with these things, and the outcome is known, which is the complete antithesis of what scientific
Of
exploration is.
yeah.
Yes.
Well, I
But
think the mantra has to be, Dad, can I have keys to the submarine?
Exactly.
I like that a lot.
So
Or
Senator
the Aquarius.
Senator Murkowski has joined us. So this is Senator Lisa Murkowski of Alaska. And she is one of the relatively few women to serve in the United States Senate and also co-chair of the Senate Oceans Caucus. But I don't know if you heard what Senator Whitehouse said when he was
It was mostly
leaving?
good.
I did not.
Well-
I did get a chance to say hello to him in the hallway, but he didn't tell me. He
Well-
said he'd warmed up the crowd.
He did, and he did a very good job. He said that you were among the people who joined that caucus. He said when he signed on to this effort, it was not going to cost him anything politically, but other people who signed on for it, it was much more an act of political bravery, and he cited you. So I wonder do you feel that's right, that it was
Well, I do not think it's an act of political bravery to stand up and support our oceans. I come from a state that is surrounded by the Arctic Ocean, the Pacific Ocean, the Bering Sea, the Chukchi Sea, the Beaufort Sea. I've got a lot of responsibility as an Alaskan and as a policymaker to be aware, to ensure that our oceans are strong and healthy and sustainable. I have so many of the communities in my state that rely on the ocean for their livelihoods. And so I don't think it's an act of political courage. I think it is a responsibility that I take. I know that there are some issues that generate their own level of controversy. One of the first forums that we had within the Oceans Caucus was focused on ocean acidification. And Sheldon said, well, are you sure you want to go there? I said, we have an office or a department within the University of Alaska that is dedicated specifically to ocean acidification. I want to understand more about it. Well, are you sure you want to go there with climate change? It doesn't have any difference to do whether or not you want to go there with climate change. The fact of the matter is our oceans are seeing some changes. I want to understand that. I believe it was you, Admiral Allen, that made the comment as it related to climate change in Alaska. You said, I'm not quite sure what's going on, but I know that I've got more ocean that I'm responsible for. Or something to that effect, and I paraphrase you a lot, so I hope I'm right.
Yeah, what I said was I was agnostic to the science. There's more water there, and I'm responsible for it.
And that's true. And as an Alaskan, truly, I grew up in coastal communities. I grew up exploring under those rocks, and it really was a level of exploration that knew no bounds. We didn't know what the right answers were. We knew that when the tide went out, things were pretty interesting. I really appreciate the fact that I came into the tail end of this conversation focused on education and how we allow our young people to explore more, to be more comfortable and familiar with the greatness of our oceans. I'm going to be leaving tomorrow morning and going out to Cordova, Alaska, where the Prince William Sound Science Center is having its annual event, and it's an opportunity for us to celebrate what we're knowing and understanding with our oceans, to better understand our science and how that all integrates. So it's a wonderful reminder to me, again, of my responsibility.
So let me ask you, I asked Senator Whitehouse if you were a betting person. The Law of the Sea Treaty there's a new effort to push it forward in the Senate. What do you think the chances are that it will pass?
I do believe it will pass. Now, your next question to me then, if you were a reporter, was, well, so when is that going to happen?
Yes.
I am hopeful that we will see passage of the Law of the Sea this year. I don't think you will see it before we move into lame duck. We've had a lot of discussions about just the politics that go along with the Law of the Sea. But I give credit to Senator Kerry for kind of laying the groundwork for hearings. They've had one hearing already in foreign relations. I know they're teed up to do more. I think it's important that people know and understand what the Law of the Sea Treaty is all about and what it means to us as a nation that has failed to ratify. We're the only nation with appreciable coastline that has failed to ratify the treaty. And again, as one who comes from the north, from the Arctic areas, I look at it perhaps a little bit differently than somebody who's focused on what may be happening down in the South China Sea. I know that we have a lot more water up there. We're seeing a level of commerce and activity that is absolutely unprecedented. To have cruise ships traveling the Northwest Passage there, to have cargo containers who are just hauling freight, hauling containers up north, unheard of. And then, of course, we're looking at the potential for resource development up there and what that might mean. The world in the north has changed. And for us to kind of sit and say, 25 years ago when this first came through, it was a treaty that didn't work for us, and so therefore I'm going to stick with that. I think that is not opening your eyes to the world around us. And to the opportunities and challenges that face us. So I'm saying we pass Law of the Sea. I'm hopeful that we do it this year before the end of the year. But I might add that it would be helpful if we had assistance. Every one of you can be an advocate with us. You know the people that we need to target and help us in educating them about the importance of Law of the Sea.
Well, I was going to ask you that, actually. I'm reminded of, I think it was Lyndon Johnson and Martin Luther King, when the passage of the Civil Rights Bill, and he famously called Martin Luther King and said, you have to organize things in such a way that it is impossible for us not to pass this. You have to generate such an outpouring of support for it that we have to pass it. Do you feel that kind of outpouring of support from the public on this issue now, or is it under the radar for many people?
I do think it's under the radar. There are certain groups and constituencies, obviously, that are more focused on it, and they are weighing in, and that is important. But our reality is that most folks really are not paying attention to it as an issue. They're looking at the big ticket items in jobs in the economy. They're following what's going on with the campaigns and the presidential, and they're just not focused with this as an issue yet. And I will tell you, it's not going to be easy in a lame duck, because in a lame duck, we're going to have a pretty crowded portfolio of activities, and we will have some colleagues who will say, this is not pressing, this is not a priority, we should be working on some other things. This is where, again, we could use your help in establishing that it is a priority, that as a nation that is viewed as a leader, we should be leading when it comes to maritime activities, security, national security. There are opportunities here, and I think we need to make it more of an imperative than it is.
Okay. Just a quick follow-on to that, Senator. Do you see the biggest hurdle being in the Foreign Relations Committee or on the floor? That helps us narrow down who we're talking about.
Well, it does help to narrow it down, and our reality is we can't get it to the floor until we get it out of foreign relations. And there are a few key votes that we need to line up in foreign relations. And I think this is one of the reasons why you're seeing kind of a go slow approach to ensure that there is a level of comfort. Again, giving credit to the chairman and to the ranking member of the Foreign Relations Committee, the approach is not just to talk about the national security component, which Admiral Allen spoke to some years ago and spoke very well. It's more than that. It's the economic interests that are at stake. It is the commercial interests. The groups that are lining up behind it, I think, are significant, and they need the time to kind of do their magic, if you will. So I'll be honest. There's some stumbling blocks in foreign relations. So we need to make sure that we're really counting our votes carefully. But once we get it out of committee, I do believe we have the 67 votes to make that happen.
Any other question?
I have a question.
Oh, go ahead.
There is a $20 billion lump of funding that could potentially serve the oceans that is tucked within the transportation bill. It's related to the BP.
Restore.
Yes, the Restore Act. Is there any hope that this can actually come to fruition? Or what is the hope that it could?
Well, we're all trying to read the tea leaves coming out of the conference there on transportation. I had actually gotten some pretty strong signals just a few weeks ago that things were looking pretty good. But it's amazing around here how quickly things can go south. And now it's not, I'm not feeling as positive a signal, but I think the commitment has clearly been made. I think on the Senate side, you've got a team of Senator Boxer and Senator Inhofe who are not political allies in many areas, but when it comes to this transportation bill, I think they feel very, very strongly that they have a good package, a package that's good for the country, and, oh, by the way, it will have a good impact on our oceans through the Restore Act. So how we piece this together, I think, is left to them, but there is a real, genuine commitment. I can't think of two more tenacious people than Boxer and Inhofe. So I'm betting, and again, I'm not typically one who would gamble, and I've already gambled once, so I'm going to do it again, and I'm going to say that we do get a transportation bill.
With that piece
With
of
Restore.
it, with the Restore Act intact.
I
Would
think
make a
on the
huge
Senate
difference
side that was a
the ocean.
key piece for many members, and I think that is very much alive in the negotiations.
Imagine funds for the ocean. What a concept.
Anybody else? Do we have any?
May I just follow up on
Yes,
funds for
sure.
the ocean? What a concept! Because I serve on the Appropriations Committee, and one area that I have been really keyed in on is making sure that we are appropriately funding the research programs that we so desperately need for the oceans, for our fisheries, in order to have that sustainability that we're all looking for. And at a time of tough budgets, I think it is important that those of us that pay attention to these programs are really working in concert. I'm pretty comfortable with where we are this year. I think that's important. We've held our own and more in certain areas, but it is critical as we look to what's happening with the discretionary side of the budget. I don't want to lose the headway that we have made with so much of the research that's important to our oceans.
There was a question over here.
Hi, Chris Mann with the Pew Environment Group. Senator, I'd like to go back to some of the comments you made about the changes we're seeing in the Arctic, and Admiral Allen may have a view on this too. With those changes in ice cover, in the fish and wildlife populations, increasing industrial activities in the Arctic, oil and gas development, and also shipping. What kinds of planning and management do you see are needed to deal with those changes in Arctic. And, you know, I understand there have been a lot of concerns about proposals coming from the administration about how to do that. But given that there is a need for planning and management, what are the approaches that you feel would work up there?
Well, I'll give some time here to Admiral Allen as well, but I think one of the key initiatives within the Arctic is what we're seeing come out of the Arctic Council and some of the proposals that have been advanced, whether it's the oil spill response plan that the Council is now working on, whether it's a search and rescue plan that was just recently concluded. But I think we recognize that in the Arctic particularly, it's going to be an area where it will be best if we are working in a cooperative and a collaborative manner, and I think that has been incredibly important in knowing and understanding just some of the rules of the road, the shipping report, the Arctic shipping report that has been commissioned. I think as we look to understand more of what we can anticipate in the Arctic, working in a collaborative manner with the other Arctic nations, I think is going to be key to some of what we may see or alternatively not see. One of the things, of course, that we have moved on early was we said in terms of the fisheries, we are not comfortable allowing commercial fisheries in those northern federal waters until we know and understand the science. We don't know it yet, so we are not prepared to embark further in that, and I think that is a critical piece of that. Admiral?
Yeah, I think it's a mixture of policy, infrastructure, investment, a lot of things that can bear on that. Senator Murkowski is right on. When I travel around the world and I talk to Coast Guard-like agencies and countries that have these challenges, there's two things that nobody disagrees on, and that's response to search and rescue and oil spill. You can always get agreement on that, cooperative agreements, and I think moving forward on that is really, really good. The problem especially with the North Slope of Alaska, is the lack of infrastructure, lack of communications capability to communicate and conduct operations up there for responses, should you need to do that. The nearest deepwater port is Dutch Harbor, which I think is 1,100 miles away. You can get into Nome, but I think it's restricted to about 22 feet. Mm-hmm. So there's an issue there about resupplying and forward basing. The United States for the last 5 or 6 years have moved Coast Guard units up there in the summer and tested their capabilities. Some helicopters work up there, some don't. You need de-icing capability. You need to be able to operate in waters. Even in the summer, there is ice in those waters up there, and certain wind conditions can give you a problem, so you need ice-strengthened vessels. I think this summer, with the exploratory drilling that Shell will be doing in the Beaufort and the Chukchi Sea, and the units that are forward deployed from the Coast Guard, is going to give us an idea of the level of commitment we need and resources in the future moving forward. There's very little infrastructure in Point Barrow to move anything more than about 30 or 40 people there. You just start running out of beds. And those are the types of things that are very, very difficult. And if you don't have those right away, then you'd be able to bring those up somehow. The issue of a floating command and control platform that an ice-strengthened vessel would bring is something very important, and we're starting to come to grips with the status of our icebreaker fleet. But it's a variety of things. And I would finally end with a policy issue related to the Law of the Sea Treaty, and that's Bering Straits are defined as a transit strait in the Law of the Sea Treaty, and that requires freedom of navigation through there. But cooperative agreement between the United States and Russia would allow us to establish traffic separation schemes that will put basically rules and regulations on how you transit through there to separate traffic and reduce the risk of collisions and groundings in that very pristine area, which is going to become one of the vital choke points in the world.
57 miles, right?
The policy of exploring first before exploiting fish doesn't apply to oil and gas, though. There's no baseline exploration of what is in the area that is being targeted for.
Yeah, this gets back to the fact you have open water where there hasn't been access to conduct research.
Well, right, but still, that's part of the problem. We need to invest in the technology and the science, whatever it takes, because we have one chance to get it right. We've never, ever had access there in all of human history. It's on our watch that the decisions will be right or wrong. And this is the moment, and it's why caution is
That's right. You often hear people say that what we're doing now is an experiment that we can only run one time?
Well, I will disagree somewhat because we have been, or there has been exploration up in both Beaufort and Chukchi back in the early 80s. In fact, a fair amount of exploration, and it was based on the results of that exploration that that these decisions now moving forward by Shell and perhaps by some others later, that's why they're moving forward. And I think it is important to recognize that this is not the first time that we have seen any level of exploration or any level of science. I think we can always do better with our science, and again, when we're looking at budgets and how we are funding, I don't think it's ever wise for us to shortchange our research dollars, because we can always learn more. But I think it is important to recognize that there have been activities up in the north insofar as exploration. No production yet.
In the Gulf of Mexico, it's obvious now that, and Admiral Allen pointed out earlier, that we wish we had baseline information that you could measure now the impact, something that you could measure against. And even in a place that wasn't covered with ice, the Gulf of Mexico, it's our backyard. Sufficient data does not exist to be able to really have the knowledge base that we wish we had to be able to tell what happened and how do we fix what happened, if we have the power to do that.
Let's have one more question, and then we'll wrap. Oh, so can we have two more questions? There we go.
Yes, Senator Murkowski, I think the kind of science that Dr. Earle is referring to, and the kind of exploration is, what is the level of hydrocarbon concentration in the sea, and what, we don't know we don't know what's living there, how much production of some of the small fish that, we don't know what that area is and its importance in terms of the chain of life and what feeds what, and we just don't know the importance and the significance. And you have one oil spill there, you don't know what you're killing.
So your question is?
My question is, is there going to be an opportunity to have that kind of research done, at least coincidentally, with the oil exploration? And will that kind of research be funded?
I think that research is ongoing now. It's not only research that is being conducted by National Science Foundation, the mapping that we're doing, the stuff that is going on up north as we speak. You also have research that is being conducted by Shell itself, by the oil companies itself. Now, some would poo-poo that and say, well, that's being funded by the companies that are looking to invest there, and so we don't really trust that research. But the fact is there is significant research that is going on and has been going on as a condition for the permits that have been granted, whether they're through NOAA or whether they are through National Fish and Wildlife or the many federal agencies that have been involved. Those have been conditions of the permits in order to be issued. So, and this has been a process that has been underway for about 6 years now. So you might not see the reports that are sitting out on the table, but in terms of the activities that have gone on in order to allow for the issuance of those permits, there has been considerable research that has been done, not only on the fisheries, but you mentioned the chain there, the food chain. The natives who live in the area still live mostly a subsistence lifestyle. Many of them do. They rely on what is in the sea. They rely on what is on the land there. They have demanded to know what the impacts are going to be. One of the reasons that you have a very truncated exploration period is not because they think they can get the job done that quickly. It is because you have bowhead whale that are migrating through, that the native people rely on. That is their subsistence hunt. It's their identity, and so there's nothing that is operating during the bowhead whale migration. So it's these types of things that have been taken into consideration for issuance of these many, many permits.
Okay, I'm informed that we are out of time.
Thank you.
So I want to thank Captain Walsh, Dr. Earl, Admiral Allen, and Senator Murkowski. Thank you for coming, and thank you all.